The parking lot was already pulsing with life by the time she stepped out of the rideshare car. Minivans honked. Valets jogged. Children screamed with joy while parents dragged strollers toward the sliding glass doors that marked the entrance to Brierstone Galleria, one of the largest and most exclusive malls in the city. The woman stood alone for a moment on the curb, blending into the crowd not by design but by nature. She didn't demand attention. She never had to. The world had taught her early that presence didn't require spectacle, only purpose. Her outfit was forgettable. A gray hoodie, sleeves slightly too long. Jeans cuffed over sneakers that had seen better seasons. She carried a small tote bag and wore no jewelry. Her hair was tied back without polish, her posture relaxed but alert. She looked like someone passing through, a commuter, maybe? Not someone who belonged among luxury storefronts with backlit names and velvet ropes. And that was exactly the way she wanted it. She moved through the mall slowly, absorbing everything. Each storefront, every display. The polished marble floors reflected neon signs and fashion ads. The air smelled of cinnamon pretzels, floor wax, and the perfume samples sprayed too liberally by the department store employees. She passed by flagship stores Gucci, Cartier, Chanel. Clerks looked up, noted her hoodie, and returned to folding cashmere. No one greeted her. No one offered help. She made her way to the heart of the mall where the wide-open atrium bathed in skylight created a spotlight that fell on the boutique she had come to see. Leonhard Atelier, a boutique known for custom outerwear, minimalist design, and pricing that assumed no one would dare ask. The coat in the window was a piece she had admired for years, cream-colored, full-length, with a soft belt and sharp lapels. It cost more than most people's rent. She had always appreciated the design, not for the price but for the craftsmanship. For the statement it made without speaking. She entered the boutique quietly. Inside, everything was soft. Light, sterile in its curated perfection. The kind of space designed to both invite and repel. White walls, glass shelving, champagne offered only to certain customers. The music was faint and French. A small cluster of salespeople stood near the counter, laughing over something on a phone. They didn't turn as she entered. Not at first. When they did, one of them, a tall, thin woman with perfect makeup and sharper cheekbones, broke away from the group and approached her. Her steps were confident, but her eyes were flat. She gave a smile so thin it nearly vanished before reaching her lips. Without asking, she stepped in front of the woman and tilted her head slightly. "Can I help you?" The woman gestured gently toward the coat on display. A silence passed. Then came the phrase, delivered with the rhythm of someone who'd said it many times. "You can't afford that." Not loud, but loud enough. From behind the counter, another salesperson laughed softly. The tall woman folded her arms almost as if guarding the coat itself. She offered a directionless wave toward a rack in the far corner of the boutique. "Maybe something from last season," she said, as though throwing a bone to a stray. The woman said nothing. No protest. No indignation. She simply turned and left the boutique. Her exit was quiet. No heads turned. No security was called. But something inside her shifted. Not with fury, but with memory. As she passed back into the mall's atrium, she reached into her tote and pulled out her phone. A quick tap opened an email thread marked urgent. Her attorneys had just confirmed the acquisition had cleared. Effective immediately, the entire property, including the boutique that had just shooed her away, was under her ownership. She looked back over her shoulder. Her eyes didn't burn with revenge. Just clarity. By the end of that day, every square foot of marble under her feet would legally be hers. Every store's rent, payroll, and occupancy status would be filed in her reports. She wasn't there to punish. But she would not forget. And neither would they. By midday, the mall had grown louder. Weekenders moved in steady tides, sipping iced coffee, juggling shopping bags, checking their reflections in mirrored columns. The clamor of music, chatter, and credit card swipes created an ambient hum that drowned out anything quiet or subtle. But amid the chaos, one woman moved like a shadow with a compass. Deliberate, silent, guided. She had stepped outside briefly, not out of discomfort but necessity. From the comfort of a waiting sedan parked discreetly behind the staff entrance, she took a series of rapid-fire calls. Her legal team confirmed lease transfers. A property manager relayed a completed inspection. Her personal assistant sent over the most recent vendor logs, employee rosters, and tenant performance summaries. Every document affirmed one fact. She now held full controlling ownership of Brierstone Galleria. It had taken years. Years of watching, planning, negotiating from the background. She had acquired companies that owned parcels. She had bought the debt behind the holding group and strategically purchased the rest through silent partners. Her name hadn't even appeared on the paperwork until 2 days ago. She didn't need credit for the climb, just the keys at the top. Now the locks belonged to her. When she stepped back into the mall through the maintenance corridor, no one noticed. The hall smelled of floor polish and fried dough from the adjacent food court, a stark contrast to the sterile designer air in the boutique wing. She passed unseen through a steel door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only" and emerged into the back offices of mall administration. A startled secretary jumped to her feet when she entered, but the woman gently raised her hand. A mall director, older and red-faced from stress, appeared moments later, visibly sweating in a too-tight shirt. He didn't recognize her, not yet, but he had received the memo. A new owner had taken control. When he asked her name and role, she handed him a folded page. One glance, and the color drained from his cheeks. In that moment, a silent truth passed between them. She was the person they all owed rent to now. She didn't speak. She simply nodded and pointed toward the office door behind him. He opened it without hesitation. Inside, she sat down at a desk that wasn't hers, but now belonged to her by contract. From this room, she would rewire the entire culture of the mall. Not through press releases but presence. First, she requested the staff directory. Second, the tenant list. Third, security footage access. She reviewed it all, flipping page by page, scanning names, hours, faces. And then she paused. There it was, Leon Hart Atelier. Tenant number 046. Lease agreement, month to month. Rent overdue by 4 days. Staff, 5 salespeople. Manager on duty, Ms. Celia Brantley. The same woman who had told her not to touch the coat. The woman who had spoken without listening. The woman who would now have to report, indirectly, to the very person she tried to erase with a glance. The owner tapped her fingers on the desk once, then calmly circled the name. She didn't need retribution. That wasn't the purpose. What she needed was clarity for them, and she would give it to them with silence, documentation, and consequences measured in paper and ink. By late afternoon, she made her way back through the mall. Still unnoticed, still unrecognized. She passed through a side door into a service corridor and entered the boutique once again. This time through the rear entrance, using her new access code. The boutique staff turned in confusion. One looked panicked, another whispered, and then she stepped out front, right into the center of the sales floor, right in front of the coat. The store manager stormed forward, ready to scold someone she assumed was trespassing, and stopped mid-step. Behind the woman, 2 men in suits had appeared, holding envelopes marked Operational Review Notice. The woman's eyes met the manager's. Still, she said nothing. She didn't need to speak. The walls were already beginning to shift. It took less than an hour for the whispers to turn into panic. By the time the envelopes were opened and the corporate seals verified, the boutique's mood had shifted from condescension to alarm. Leon Hart Atelier, once the crown jewel of the mall's fashion wing, was now the subject of a surprise operational audit, the kind reserved for delinquent tenants, lease violators, or stores with multiple customer service complaints. On paper, it was protocol. In reality, it was the first quiet movement of a deeper reckoning. The manager, Celia Brantley, scrambled. Her voice quivered as she called headquarters, attempting to bypass the people now walking through her store with clipboards and body cameras. Every drawer was inspected, every staff file reviewed, every receipt matched against the point-of-sale system. Employees stood stiffly behind the register, trying not to look guilty of the sin they'd already committed: arrogance. She watched them from across the atrium. She didn't return to the boutique after that initial confrontation. She didn't need to. From the admin office balcony, she could see the entire ground floor, each glossy storefront, every pathway branching out into marble corridors and mirrored turns. Briarstone was her chessboard now, and her opponent had already moved first in error. The mall director entered her office with a trembling voice, carrying a stack of folders. "There's been confusion," he said. She nodded but didn't respond. There was an incident earlier with one of the tenants. She raised her hand lightly. His sentence died midair. She opened the folder marked Tenant Compliance and placed it on the desk between them. Inside, the detailed performance history of Leon Hart Atelier. Repeated infractions. 3 late payments. A customer complaint involving racial profiling from 2 months earlier. All previously brushed under the rug. Now, under her leadership, the rug no longer existed. "We've been meaning to take corrective action," the director mumbled. She tapped once on the complaint document. Then on the lease clause she had revised less than 72 hours ago. Zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. She slid the paper back across the desk. "No second chances?" the director asked. She didn't blink. The silence answered him. Below, the boutique had gone quiet. A few customers turned away from the windows as employees posted a discreet sign on the door. Temporarily closed for internal review. Shoppers murmured. Phones recorded. Whatever veneer the store had maintained began to peel, layer by layer. The clerk who had laughed during her first visit was now seated behind the glass counter, head in hands. The manager stood outside on her phone, her gestures frantic. And the coat? Still in the window, still untouched, but now dimmed by the realization of what it represented. Not wealth, not fashion, but a missed opportunity to treat a human being with decency. That evening, after the doors locked and the crowd thinned, she walked the mall alone. The janitors had begun their shift. The kiosks were covered in cloth. Security patrolled the upper level. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. She walked the same hallways that had once felt cold, unfamiliar, judgmental. But now they were hers. She passed Leon Hart one more time. Celia was gone. The lights were off. The coat in the window stood under a fading spotlight. She paused, looked at it not with longing, but with a kind of calm detachment. Then she walked on. She wasn't interested in buying what she already owned. What mattered now wasn't the coat. It was the culture behind the glass. And she intended to change it. The next morning arrived with the quiet authority of inevitability. There were no press releases, no headlines, but inside the walls of Briarstone Galleria, change had begun to root itself deep, silent, and unyielding. The new ownership wasn't announced over intercoms or plastered on welcome banners. It echoed in policy, posture, and presence. By 9 a.m., the operations office had shifted to a new rhythm. A new dress code memo had gone out, not for style but for respect. A revised training packet landed in every tenant inbox with bolded sections on racial bias, class profiling, and inclusive conduct. Mandatory workshops were scheduled. Voluntary resignations trickled in from those who felt suddenly misunderstood. She let them go without resistance. There was no desire to cleanse the mall, only to elevate it. Cameras captured the changes. Staff who once scowled now stood straighter, offering greetings. Security guards who had been instructed to monitor suspicious individuals now received new protocols based on conduct, not appearance. Kiosks and food court vendors received upgrades long promised but never delivered. Maintenance requests were cleared within hours, not weeks. The changes weren't loud, but they were undeniable. In her office, she studied data more than faces. Transaction flows, foot traffic metrics, demographic heat maps, these told the real story of who was spending, who was ignored, who was profiled. She didn't seek apologies, she sought accuracy. Under her leadership, the mall would no longer be a place of exclusion camouflaged as luxury. It would be a mirror of the city it stood in, diverse, complex, alive. The boutique was still shuttered. The internal audit uncovered more than attitude. It revealed financial carelessness, fraudulent markdowns, and a pattern of underreporting sales to dodge lease percentage agreements. The store's corporate owners sent apologies, promises, and a mid-tier executive bearing gifts. She declined the meeting. Instead, she issued a formal notice of non-renewal. They had 60 days to vacate. The space wouldn't sit empty for long. Her team had already begun curating a list of minority-owned fashion labels that had been denied access to luxury malls across the country. She reached out to 3 of them directly. Each conversation ended the same way, with disbelief, then tears, then a signed lease. They would not enter through the back door. They would be on display. Later that day, as she stood by the mezzanine railing overlooking the atrium, she watched the old signs being taken down. The gold-plated letters of Leonhard Atelier were peeled from the wall, one by one. No one applauded. There was no audience. But somewhere deep in the marrow of the building, something shifted. It was no longer just marble and metal. It was becoming something human. A young girl passed her with her mother, brown skin, bright eyes, gripping a small purse and pointing excitedly at a toy store. The woman smiled at the girl, then looked up and offered a polite nod as they crossed paths. It was the kind of moment the mall had once quietly discouraged. Now it was welcome. She returned to her office, pulled open a drawer, and placed a small photo beside her monitor. It showed her mother, smiling, tired, standing in a dress she made herself in a neighborhood that had long since been paved over. Her mother had once worked in a department store, never allowed to wear the clothes she sold. Told not to speak unless spoken to. Corrected for smiling too widely at the wrong customers. Fired for refusing to stay silent. She looked at the photo now, not with sadness, but with pride. The daughter of that woman now owned every inch of space her mother had once been afraid to enter. The days moved forward, but something about the rhythm inside Briarstone Galleria had permanently changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those who passed through for a coffee, a handbag, a child's birthday outfit. But for those who worked there, who spent hours under the buzz of overhead lights and behind polished counters, the atmosphere had shed its skin. Gone was the hierarchy built on assumptions. In its place was a new architecture of expectation, one built not on deference but on respect. She no longer had to patrol. Her presence was woven into the schedule, the audits, the unseen layers of structure she had designed with precision. Her influence extended like roots beneath stone, present, essential, and undeniable. She didn't need to speak for things to move. A single signature could now change the fate of an entire corridor. One email could determine whether a brand stayed or disappeared. Word had spread. Tenants who once ignored her now waited nervously during lease reviews. Some brought gifts they pretended were gestures, not bribes. Others clumsily referenced inclusion and community support in rehearsed tones. She didn't entertain flattery. She listened only to actions, staff diversity, complaint logs, community outreach programs. If they aligned with her vision, they stayed. If not, they left. Meanwhile, the empty boutique that once stood as a monument to exclusion was reborn. In its place, a storefront called Mosaic, a name chosen to reflect unity in contrast. Its glass panes were etched with quotes from Black poets, immigrant entrepreneurs, and women who had been told they didn't belong. Inside, mannequins wore designs from previously invisible creators. Prices varied, but the atmosphere never did. Everyone was treated like a client. The grand reopening was never announced. It simply happened. People came. Some out of curiosity, some out of resistance, but many out of hope. Lines formed not for discounts, but for belonging. The space pulsed with something the mall had never known, warmth. From her office, she watched not as a queen surveying a kingdom, but as a builder watching her design come alive. One afternoon, as she walked the second-floor concourse, a former employee of Leonhard Atelier approached her. His suit was wrinkled now, his expression uncertain. He started to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, but faltered halfway. She looked at him calmly, without malice, and said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the lesson had already landed. Words would have diluted it. He lowered his gaze and walked on. She continued down the corridor toward the newly opened community space, a room she'd carved out near the West Wing food court. What was once unused square footage was now a pop-up mentorship center for local teen entrepreneurs. The first session was starting. Inside sat 6 students, notebooks open, eyes wide with possibility. They didn't know who she was. Not yet. But she intended to be there, quietly, every week. She entered and sat in the back, listening as one student described his dream to start a sneaker brand. Another talked about a clothing line named after her grandmother. Their passion cut through the noise of retail and routine. It reminded her why she had started this journey. Not to own a mall, but to unlock its gates for everyone who had been told, you can't afford that. The phrase was no longer an insult in her story. It had become her mission. And she was far from finished. Winter arrived gently, layering the edges of the city in soft silver. Shoppers shuffled in wrapped coats, breath curling like ribbons in the cold air as they entered Briarstone Galleria, now alight with warm seasonal displays. But this winter, the decor wasn't simply festive, it was intentional. Each store window echoed stories of resilience. Mannequins wore designs by creators who once sold out of cardboard boxes. Children's books featured diverse heroes. Music spilled from speakers in rhythms that included more than one culture. At the center of it all stood the woman no one saw coming. Not because she had hidden, she never had, but because they'd never thought to look. Now she was everywhere. Her initials quietly adorned the footer of every lease agreement. Her policies guided every staff training. Her vision echoed in the faces of new vendors, in the laughter of customers who had once felt unwelcome. She was no longer a mystery. She was the pulse of the place. An article had made the rounds, an exposé in a respected business magazine titled "The Quiet Takeover: How a Black Woman Rewrote the Luxury Rulebook." It had gone viral. Social media erupted. Half the comments were awe, the other half outrage. But none of it mattered. The work was already done. She declined all interview requests. There was nothing she needed to explain. On the final Saturday before Christmas, the atrium buzzed with a celebratory energy. A new installation had been announced, a permanent tribute to the city's unseen builders. Not celebrities, not investors, but workers. Mothers, janitors, bus drivers, teachers, dreamers. Those who were always present but rarely praised. She stood on the mezzanine above the crowd as a red curtain dropped, revealing a sculpture, a tall bronze figure, mid-step, wearing no brand, no suit, just plain clothes and a head held high. On the base was a single phrase: "I belong here." The crowd clapped. A child tugged at her mother's coat and pointed up to the mezzanine. "Is that her?" The mother squinted, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I think it is." She offered a small wave, then stepped back, disappearing into the shadows behind the glass railing. Not to hide, but because her story didn't need a spotlight. Later that evening, she walked alone through the closing mall. Lights dimmed. Stores locked their gates. A cleaner waved as she passed. She nodded back. She stopped one last time in front of Mosaic. The coat that had once been a symbol of rejection no longer sat in a window. Instead, a framed quote had replaced it. "Luxury is not what you wear, it's how you are seen, and who is allowed to be seen at all." She smiled, not for the victory, but for the journey. Then she turned, walked down the corridor, and out into the night. Not just as a woman who could afford everything inside those walls, but as the one who now owned the walls themselves, and made sure the doors stayed open for everyone.